If I could ask everyone to mute your lines and also shut off your video unless you're presenting, that would be absolutely wonderful. So, hello everyone. I am Bruce Brenstall of Montana Housing in Helena, and I am your room host for today. We are so excited that you can join us today. Please mute your lines and use the chat function for questions. We will try and address all questions before the end of the session. Just a few housekeeping items. All sessions are being recorded, so keep that in mind. Please mute your lines and turn off your video while presenters are presenting. I think that will help with distractions, and also I think the feeds will be a little bit better. Please click the chat icon and select all panelists and attendees and enter your name, organization, and location, please. And you may turn your video back on during our Q&A time. Each of you should have received a whiteboard paddle with a marker. And if you find something inspiring, exciting, or new, write a quick adjective on the whiteboard, hold it up, and let us know during Q&A time at the end of the video. There's a good example of awesome. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jim McGrath. Jim, can you give me 1 second? I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone, and then just take yourself off mute. And if folks could turn their videos off, that would be really great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bruce. Welcome. I'm Jim McGrath. I'm the Director of HUD Programs at the Missoula Housing Authority. We're going to have a nice visit today about our exciting new permanent supportive housing project, which opened in December, Cornerstone. We're going to come at it in a couple of different ways, which we'll get to in a minute. It's all exciting to see. I see a lot of names of familiar folks. Good to see you. I actually didn't realize this was virtual, and I drove to Helena and checked into the Delta Hotel, and that's where I'm at for this live presentation. So anyway, so we're going to start off with Ted Madsen from the Montana Healthcare Foundation to give us an overview of the FUSE program, which plays a part in this project. And then Lori Davidson, the Executive Director of the Housing Authority here in Missoula, will talk a little bit about how it came to be in sort of the development process. And then we're going to have a panel of our on-the-ground experts, a core part of the operational team. There's actually more than we could fit on a panel, and to talk a little bit about how we pull together the day-to-day combination of services and property management and so on to make this thing go. And then hopefully we'll have time for some questions from folks that are attending. So let's get started. I'll turn it over to Ted to talk to us about the FUSE project and then how we fit into that.
Great, thanks, Jim. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm trying to get my slideshow going here. Can everyone see that housing slide there? All right, thumbs up. So looking at the attendee list, it looks like a lot of you are pretty familiar with the Housing as Healthcare Initiative, the foundation, and our FUSE work. So I'll go through pretty quickly these slides and just give a few updates, but also show some context of the work we're doing and how it relates to this great work in Cornerstone. I always show the iceberg because at a housing conference, you have a wide range of housing issues. And we know that, thank you all for every organization and entity that works on this wide array of issues. And you try to, affect change and outcomes in all aspects of these. The FUSE works, the Housing as Healthcare work really focuses on that tip of the iceberg, as we say, the chronically homeless, folks that are frequent users of emergency, ER, civic systems, emergency systems in your communities. So these are high needs users that really, require complex, they're complex clients, and they require equally complex and well-coordinated solutions. And I think Cornerstone is a good example of that. And our other, I guess, our other, work at the foundations, that's where we're starting as a healthcare foundation, working with those folks that, are have housing issues and healthcare access needs. Because we know if we affect that change, that part of the iceberg, those system changes or system ideas can hopefully help upstream as well. I'm just going to go through these other slides pretty quickly. This is some of the research we've used as we kind of promoted this project and our work here. We've done some field trips to Boise, Idaho, to Denver, really to look at those systems that take the housing first approach, where really that first step towards improved health is getting someone housed. And the next step to make sure they remain housed is giving them that really integrated health and housing support that they need to stay housed. So I'm going to move quickly here. And this schematic's a little busy, but it really describes our approach at the foundation, that we're working in the 7 biggest communities now in Montana. We really started with the green, which was the fuse work of really working with corporation supportive housing and the demand of who are these folks that are chronically homeless. They work, they utilize a lot of different systems. We've done cross-system data matches, really in some communities for the first time, getting those housing providers together with those healthcare providers and emergency system providers to look at that. And then that's branched into that phase 2, really trying to map out some examples, some pilot projects to prioritize the supply of services and the coordination of services with the supply of housing units to those most vulnerable in the community. And we found that a lot of these clients also need that health care team coordination. They need that mental health support, substance use support, or access, I should say, when they're ready, and the primary care teams. So that's been the continuum, and Missoula was one of our first cohorts, and so they're a little farther along in the continuum, along with Butte and Bozeman and Helena and Great Falls. But it's exciting for Cornerstone to really stand up that first model in Montana that really is taking that housing first, well-coordinated systems through Partnership Health Center, through the city of Missoula, through the Missoula Housing Authority, to coordinate all those different boxes there. Just some of the other work we're doing, knowing that the local communities can work very hard and look at coordinating systems, but it's just as important that some of our statewide agencies do the same. So, Department of Commerce and Housing has been a great partner. So has DPHHS and Bob Buzzis and the Continuum of Care to really share information and prioritize strategies will be a big emphasis over the next couple of years across those agencies as we learn more and can share information and data from the local communities. DPHH has been great, and so has Continuum of Care with the HMIS system and other systems to really look at the impact of those high needs individuals and hopefully show those outcomes, or not hopefully, we plan to show those outcomes to really demonstrate the impact of these initiatives in the local and the hard work the local communities are doing. One of the big lessons learned early on too was, that continuum of services that the agency is providing. We've done some local mapping in 2 or 3 communities where those agencies providing those pre-tenancy and tenancy support services in terms of going out and doing the outreach under bridges, doing the landlord engagement, and really using coordinated entry in the fuse list to prioritize housing units and advocacy to get folks housed. And then that housing care coordination and housing retention, that middle box, is maybe a different agency or kind of blends into those primary care provider teams or a PACT teams. And so it's how to coordinate those warm handoffs as well, knowing that different agencies provide those different services and they might get funded differently. And so trying to coordinate that and maximize reimbursement and sustainability is a key and a big priority as housing units are prioritized, is really working on the service integration package and penciling that out. And that's where Missoula has been working with Corporation for Supportive Housing, and so have other agencies as well. But really, this is one of the big lessons learned over the last year is you can set up the units, you can set up the services, but really you have to coordinate those services across agencies. And that can be difficult, but it also can be beneficial as people start sharing those cases and figuring out what are those warm handoffs. We're also trying to work internally at the Healthcare Foundation because we do a lot of work with community crisis response in local communities and making sure that the Fuse folks and the housing as healthcare work is coordinated with those other providers. So actually tomorrow I'll be giving this a similar presentation to some of the community crisis initiatives and those respondents in the state. So I'm talking quickly. There'll be time for Q&A after, but really we want to go to the main show here. I think what's next for the foundation is we want to, over the next few months, we'll be rolling out a rural learning collaborative. We're in the 7 biggest communities, so we call them the AA schools. But really we want to start looking at those Class A schools, the Livingston, Libby's, Laurel's, Lewistowns. I'm trying to think of all the L's here. But if you're interested in that, please put your name in the chat or email me with my contact information. And really, we're going to set up a kind of a monthly learning collaborative with different communities and partners across communities. And then have CSH kind of guide us through those different educational aspects and do the Fuse on a wider spread, a collaborative basis with a learning community. So I think that's it. I just want to say hats off to Missoula and the Cornerstone project to really, start looking at those complex solutions and coordinated services for those most vulnerable in the community. Because if you're not seeing these folks, nobody is. And it's just great to see you, roll up your sleeves and really coordinate across agencies and see these great partnerships. So thank you.
Thanks, Ted. And now I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Lori Davidson, a long-standing leader in Montana housing and the executive director of the Missoula Housing Authority. And you are muted.
Yes, I am muted. Now I am not.
Do we get points in the conference for saying that for the first time? Because I think that's
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you, Ted, for that that great presentation on the Fuse project. That's such an important part of what's happening in the state right now. I'm going to share my screen. I have a little slideshow here. I don't care about that. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. So Cornerstone was conceived probably around 2018. We started planning for it. We had some land at a site where we have another building, which is Valor House. And I'll show you a picture of the site in just a moment. But before we get there, I think it's important to point out that when you are considering doing a supportive housing project, there's 2 different things that you need to be thinking about. One of them is, how do you build it, or how do you acquire it and rehab it? And in our case here, we built new. And the other is, how do you operate it? What do you use for operating funds? Obviously, people who are homeless, who've been homeless for a long time, most likely have no income, or very little income. So it's, you couldn't function with just charging rents, which is what the private market does. So at Cornerstone, we had to be creative in thinking about how we were going to fund both of those aspects of a permanent supportive housing project. On the construction side, what allowed us to do this project was the State Housing Trust Fund. We'd always planned to put a second building on our site where Valor House is, but until the trust fund money became available, there really wasn't a source of funding that could allow us to do that. So the State Housing Trust Fund, we applied for that, and they awarded us $991,000. MHA also had our own funds for building. These are funds that we've acquired through other development projects, and they were unrestricted funds. And our board being a strong supporter of this kind of housing and wanting to do a project like this for many years, they approved the use of our own funds. We initially thought that would be around 600,000, but we've ended up spending about 760,000 of our own funds. We also have an AHP grant, an Affordable Housing Program grant through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines, and that was for 480,000. And so as we started to plan Cornerstone, we procured an architect, MMW, started designing the project. We met with the residents at Valor House, because this is going to be, I'll go ahead and go through some of these slides here. The project is 12 one-bedroom units. As Ted spoke about already, we tried to do our best to make this a housing first model. I met early with Aaron Pehan and agreed that this project would house Fuse participants. So that was, it met the goals of the 10-year plan, Missoula's 10-year plan to end homelessness. So as we went through the process of, here you can see the site. This is Valor House here in the background, and Cornerstone is just starting to be built here. Another one that gives a different view of the site. We worked with Edgel Building, and we actually did a low bid process here, and the low bidder ended up being about almost $500,000 over our budget, which immediately caused us to have to kind of put on the brakes, go back, do a bunch of value engineering to bring this project into a budget that we can afford. We also had to go out and find some more funding for the construction. So I went to the Montana Board of Housing, and they agreed to give us a $150,000 loan. That was also where we bumped up the amount that MHA had to bring in. We thought we were going to be a project of just under 2 million. We ended up being a project of about 2.4 million. So we didn't have to give up too much. We just changed various things, and some of the materials that we were using to accommodate this value engineering. One of the things that we were thinking, that just another picture of the construction as it's going on. One of the things that we thought we were going to have to value engineer out was this efficient heat pump cooling system that MMW had designed in. But it was at that point that we partnered with Climate Smart and Clearwater Credit Union. Climate Smart has a program that connects you to funders that will bring in additional money so that you don't have to give up a more efficient heating system. We were prepared to go to an electric baseboard system, which would have saved us about $22,000. But instead, through the Climate Smart connection with Clearwater Credit Union, Clearwater wanted to invest in carbon credits, and we received a $22,000 grant from Clearwater in order to be able to keep this more efficient heating system. Here's just a illustration of what the heat pumps look like and what the heating unit inside the unit looks like. This is Colin Lane, our architect, and Claire Pepper, who's also on the architectural team. Little photo of what the kitchen looks like in the upstairs units. These are big, bright units. The end units have great views of the mountains. They, as I said, they're all 1 bedroom. Nicely featured. They all have a private balcony or a patio. One of the things, this lawn in here is between Valor House and Cornerstone. And we initially thought maybe we would put up fencing there or something that would separate the two buildings. But from the conversations we had with the veterans at Valor House, they didn't want that. They thought it would be great to be able to mingle with the Cornerstone folks if they chose to. The Cornerstone folks also had their private balconies, so they didn't have to mingle. But the Valor House residents didn't want that separation, so we left that as an open space. And the project opened in January of 2020. We started to lease up. We are almost completely full. I think we still have 1 unit to fill. I'm gonna turn that over to our panelists to discuss. But as I was talking about, the other piece that you have to solve when you're thinking about building permanent housing is how do you operate it? Rents are not gonna support a building of this size, a project of this size. We are fortunate enough at the Housing Authority to have a Section 8 voucher program, and we project base those vouchers into projects like this. So through those project-based vouchers, the rents are subsidized. So even if people have 0 income, the project is still bringing in rent. And it's with those rents that we are able to support the operations of the project. And the value engineering that we did not have to do for the heating system also is saving us about $10,000 a year in operating costs, because we have this very efficient heating system instead of having to go to the baseboards. So the construction, as complicated as that seems, is actually the easy part of putting together this project. The operations of bringing in the supportive services, I think, were much more difficult and challenging, and our team worked on that for a very long time. So I'm going to turn this over back to Jim so that he can have our panelists discuss the challenges and the successes we've had in bringing in the supportive services and being able to provide these very comfortable homes for people who need it the most. Jim?
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, we opened in December of 2020, right at the end of the year. So we're gonna do this little panel. We have folks that are we're working on our team for to do property management and oversee that from the Housing Authority side. So we'll have Mary Melton, who's our asset manager, and Ellie Greenwood, who is a property manager who has responsibility for this property as well as several others. And then also we have a couple of the team from that were supportive services providers, Anna Niles, who is with Partnership Health Center, or both of with Partnership Health Center in Missoula, but she's connected with the Fuse Project, so has that lens to look at, and then Lisa Soroy, who is involved with our coordinated entry system. She's the housing navigator, and so is helping on direct outreach and with bringing clients in. And so what we wanted to do is sort of talk about each of us having a certain role or hat that we're wearing that we can use as a lens, and think about what we brought to the conversations. We began talking together not very long after we broke ground. It was certainly at least a year before it opened, which frankly is it might even be a late start. So we began a conversation with the and meetings, and we were developing various things and bring to it what our what our expectations and needs were from our role in trying to learn those. I think what we're going to be talking about mostly in this panel is really those expectations on different levels. So I guess I'll start with that first question, talking about our process, year-long series of meetings. How important is that? And if you're thinking about some advice to someone else trying to develop a project, who should be in those meetings and what expectations should they bring? I think I will. I don't really have any particular game plan on who I'll start with, so I'll just start with Anna, and then we'll ask some others.
Great. I thought you might call on me first. As Jim mentioned, I'm Anna Hillis. I'm the Fuse Program Manager at Partnership Health Center. And I'm not sure if this was said before, but just so everyone knows, Fuse stands for Frequent Users of System Engagement, a program that identifies individuals who are frequently accessing crisis services. And so my role, just to give briefly, is to really, in a way, be kind of an air traffic controller of agencies and clients we're working on to like bring this full vision of Fuse together in Missoula. And so early on, as Jim mentioned, this question of how did we prep for Cornerstone? I was there to provide that housing first view. That was the lens that I operated in and continue to operate in, although the Housing Authority is well versed in that. I was there as that role and advocate of how do we, reduce barriers and things like that that might be there. I think that who was at the table for those meetings, so it was everyone on this panel minus Ted and Lori. And then our housing retention specialist at the time, Sue, she was in those meetings. And then Jill Bonney, who is now the executive director of the Poverello Center, going to be, but she manages programs at the Poverello Center, which is our shelter, and used to manage the Valor House from the programs perspective. And so she was really great to have, I think, for Missoula Housing Authority and the service providers to have that view of like, how does this currently operate a similar program? And we met, was it bi-weekly? I think we could have done weekly. There are a lot of small details that you just miss because it's a new project and it's new to everyone. And just operating how things actually play out on Missoula Housing Authority, how they actually play out on partnership end, they're hard to catch until you're like really in it. And so I'm sure we'll all touch on that when we expand a little more, but I think those key players were necessary, and I think more frequent meetings are definitely necessary as well. I'll keep it brief, so I'll hand it off.
Okay, Mary, how about you?
Sure. I am the asset manager for Missoula Housing Authority, so I oversee all of our physical property management. And I think we kind of expected this to be somewhat similar to another homeless property that we have, the Uptown Motel, which we've had for quite some time. What, since 2005, Jim?
Yep.
And it's not quite the same thing. Obviously, we have people in this project who are much higher needs than some of the other homeless people. But I think, it's the first year or the first 6 months of the first year, quite honestly. I think the biggest barrier that we have right now is that we really don't have on-site management, and that makes this a little bit more difficult. So I also think that we have some hopes for Trinity, which will be the next project that will have permanent supportive housing in it. And I think that we should probably start conversations about and around how we would like that program to work, with what we've learned from Cornerstone, which is quite a bit, and it's still evolving. It's not perfect, but we're trying.
So Ellie, you want to take a turn and talk about those meetings, what expectations people should bring to those, or who should be at them?
Sure. Thanks for calling me Ellie as opposed to Pandy, which it says on the screen here. That could give you a little insight into how the meetings went for me. I ended up with my Zoom password as my name. So there were a lot of meetings where there were some technological challenges during the pandemic. My initial expectation as the property manager at Cornerstone was that managing Cornerstone would be challenging and more difficult than managing my other two buildings. My other two properties are a senior property with 70 tenants over 55 and a 24-month transitional program for 17 homeless veterans that has 24/7 staff into that mix there. A few months before Cornerstone opened, or really more than a few months, I mean, I can't believe it was actually a full year, but it seemed like in the months before it opened, I was feeling like, as the property manager, that we were having endless team meetings. And I was finding it difficult to blend my lens as a property manager with the lens of supportive housing and supportive services, and along with the reality of the physical building that we had landed in. I could also say that in one of those meetings, and I wish I could say when and who and where, I heard the term hardest to house. And it kind of stopped my heart. I have to admit and be honest with you about that. And so unfortunately, certain things stick in my brain, and that sort of stuck to my brain like glue. It was nice to hear Ted use a different phrase today, which is high need people, as opposed to hardest to house people. So there's a lot of need. There's also a lot of need in any tenant population in any building that MHA is managing. But I think that kind of was a little bit of a mental block for me. I don't know if I should go on here and talk a little bit about how that actually turned out, Jim, or you want me to wait?
Let's let Lisa take a initial take, and then we can take another round.
Yeah, I guess I'll kind of echo that framing idea. I do housing navigation, as was said earlier, so I'm really coming in as that. I like to think client perspective, kind of like on the ground, what the barriers really are, and navigating this whole process of getting folks into apartments and voucher programs. And something, as I've been reflecting on this, that I think would have been helpful earlier on in the process was to have a space where we did some framing together around definitions of like a lot of these concepts we talk about. So like housing first, engagement, agency, low barrier, and like what we in our realms see those phrases to mean, because someone such as myself, it's like the same words, right? You would think you'd have the same perspective of what it means, but in my realm as a service provider, I have a slightly different view of those terms than maybe the property manager or the housing authority does in their realm. And both are valid and good, but I think having that mutual understanding that our frames are a little bit different, which we did have, but just really naming it could be really helpful as you go through this process, because there's a little bit of a healthy tension between these different frames that we're all working within. And thankfully, I mean, we all have this shared goal of really wanting this project to work, and it's just kind of working with those, that tension is the word that comes to mind, and making it all come together well. So I'll leave it at that for now and see where we go from here.
Great. Actually, that sort of segues into the next question I was going to bring up was, I mean, there is a a healthy tension between roles in a project like this. And I wanted to, hear from you talking about what some of your normal tendencies might be, and you introduced that at least already, and how your that may have changed, or what expectations may have shifted, or what you learned through that dialogue and process. Um, who wants to pick that one up to start off with? Ellie, want to go? Or?
I don't know if I can do it exactly the way that you just framed it there, Jim, but I can start out by just talking a little bit more about picking up on that thread of like, okay, well, I'm understanding from the meetings and people who are initiating the program that this is a supportive housing, permanent supportive housing program. I'm also hearing that these are folks that are going to have had a difficulty being housed in the community already. They may have adverse rental histories, et cetera. So I was just preparing myself for 12 really unbelievably hard tenants to come into the building. And I just want to add a little quantitativeness to this presentation. Really, only 3 out of our 11 tenants at Cornerstone have been more difficult than other difficult tenants in my other properties. So that's really only 27% for you people who like percentages. And that's not bad when you break it down in numbers. That means 73% of the folks at Cornerstone are tenants that are doing just fine on any given day. And they're not causing me as the property manager any heartache or heartburn. 27%, I will go ahead and say, is a slightly higher number of sort of labor intensive tenants than you might have at a normal property on any given day. But for me, I just want to make it clear that those percentages are a measure that force me as a property manager, when I've been asked to give a presentation and reflect on expectations, to be more honest with myself when I'm feeling overwhelmed by a project that's really just in its initial stages and we're hip deep in some pretty difficult dynamics. Is that really when you step back and you look at it, the people here in this building are not all that different than any of the people in my other buildings. Maybe there's a little bit more going on here, but that's to be expected from people who haven't been housed consistently, who have been consistently homeless, and who bring all those issues that brought them into homelessness with them when they move into the apartments. So I'll leave it at that.
So we're actually getting some pretty good, a couple of good questions in the chat, and we might as well just slide into them because they're actually along the same lines of what we have been thinking about. Mary, there's a question about, can you talk a bit more about any adjustments you had to make around the tolerance to your property management approach? Keep in mind, of course, that the Housing Authority has manages a number of properties that have different levels of services and needs in them. So it may not have been as far of a walk as some other property management company, but you want to talk about adjustments that we may have made for Cornerstone?
Sure. I mean, the Housing Authority, as Jim said, we tend to be a little bit more lenient, I guess, before we take action. Here, we've actually built in even more, I think, leniency. So if someone does something that normally we would give them a lease violation for, we're probably going to give them a verbal warning or two. Going to give them, a lease warning instead of a lease violation, and just kind of moving along those lines. We also coordinate with the case managers who are working at any given time with a tenant, and bring them into the mix as well. Also, instead of, say, sending something, sending a lease warning or a lease violation out, we're going to meet with people in person so that we can get their reactions. And actually, Ellie can talk about this a little bit more, probably Anna and Lisa as well. That's actually been pretty eye-opening for us, quite honestly, on some levels about how we interpret the rules and how, you know, the residents themselves interpret the rules. So yeah, it's been interesting. Um, it's been, it hasn't really been a huge challenge for us, except for, a couple of instances, I think.
Jim, I was just wondering, I know Anna, I sat in on a Fuse meeting a few weeks ago and you talked about some of the case conferencing that happens. Because to your point, I mean, Anna shared some data there where some of these tenants, I think 5 of the tenants had at least 30 ED visits in the last year, some had up to 70, multiple, criminal justice interactions. And what goes through my mind a little bit is how are we supporting the supportive housers that are doing the supportive housing units? Because you're right, you're 6 months into this, and what we've seen in some of these other models out there, that it does take a lot of time to kind of coordinate those efforts and get that understanding. So Anna, or whoever, who runs the care, the case management, weekly case management meeting, so you can kind of share the, I won't say burden, but the coordination, across the housing needs and the healthcare needs or other needs.
I can talk about that and also answer this other question because those I feel like, well, so when Cornerstone, when we started filling the units, we had a housing retention specialist who was working with the individuals living there. Since then, they have left and we're in transition to Open Aid Alliance coming in and filling that gap in supportive services, which will provide a case manager and a counselor on site for only a set amount of hours a week. And so I think that had, like some others have mentioned, not having that 24-hour supportive services on site has been a really big challenge for all of us because it does take a lot of time in these first 6 months to make sure people are adjusting and comfortable and just figuring out all those little details. So as of right now, normally what would happen with the retention person is they would work with that person, but their end goal would be to connect them to these more sustainable supportive services in the community, like case management with a mental health agency, or being on the PAC team at Western Montana Mental Health Center, or working with our complex care manager at Partnership Health Center to really form this team out in the community for them to have that wraparound service. And so that's something that we're looking to standardize more as Open Aid Alliance comes in, because at first it wasn't very structured. I was kind of letting that person do their thing. And I think we're all learning that we need to have structure in those meetings. So every meeting you are talking about rent. Maybe you're checking in about something on the lease, like how do you do your work order? Checking in on not filling the laundry machine up all the way because it's free laundry and people are really shoving their clothes in, which can be bad. So just providing, more structure to make sure we're like really covering the points of making people successful in their housing and like giving that time and space to adjust. I'm trying to read the rest of that question really quick. Yeah, I would say really it is just a work in progress, and I am happy to go into more detail with anyone. So I will put my email in the chat if someone wants to reach out, just because I could go on for days about this question. So hopefully I gave good enough synopsis.
And I'm going to let Ellie speak to it in a minute. I just want to also expand the picture a little bit. The Housing Authority all along thought, well, and actually our partners in the Fuse program thought, well, 12 Fuse is a lot for one building. Maybe we don't want to necessarily have all very high needs, maybe a mixture. And so we ended up, for example, 3 of the 12 units are actually project-based HUD-VASH. So the VA is providing supportive services to homeless vets. That's actually the remaining unit that has not been filled yet. And so they bring their own resources to that table. It's a very solid resource, but also they join us in our conferencing. And then we actually have some folks that are coming out of the non-congregate shelter here through the health department. So they're, have a different set of needs and different set of services linkage to them. So that's helpful. We don't have, we talked about that throughout our process before we opened. I kept asking how, what our criteria would be to make those determinations, and we don't really have that fixed yet. But the idea being that when we have someone that moves out and we're going to move somebody else in, at that point we'll want to look and see what the building is like, who's there, what's the best match for moving someone else in. So that was something that we'll have to develop down the road, but it's certainly something we've seen in other models around the region. Ellie, did you want to speak about the service and coordination and that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier that it's sometimes, those two lenses are hard to blend because frankly, we just have different jobs. See, my job is as a property manager is really to, as much as possible, help people to be compliant with the lease because it's a legal document. It's also going to be what leads them to a positive landlord reference, which would help them access housing if at some point in time they decided they no longer wanted to live at Cornerstone. Collecting rent is still something that you have to do, even though, it's not necessarily like, as Lori mentioned, the rents here in this building are going to carry the building, but it's still part of being a renter. You have to pay, a third of your income to live in the building. And there has been a lot of confusion, quite honestly, or I don't want to say a lot of confusion, but there's been some confusion for some of our tenants about paying that money, not letting your money run out before the 5th of the month so that you can make that rent payment. I think I want to circle back a little bit to something that Mary said about also how maybe people who haven't been housed more recently in a rental situation or haven't been successful in that rental situation. Maybe they've been living in motels with a voucher during the pandemic, or maybe they've been camping out or living in their cars or living at the shelter. It's still different than living in your own apartment and being responsible for your apartment. And what we had understood from supportive service housing programs that we visited was that one thing that can really kind of sync up program or shoot it in the foot, so to speak, at the very beginning is if people come in, they move into their apartment, then their street associates and friends come and want to stay with them in that apartment because they have an apartment now. And so they might feel a little guilty, or they might feel like they should be generous. Maybe this person helped them out when they were on the street. And so they don't want to have to say no to that person. So we make that easier by asking people not to have overnight guests for the first 30 days. So we tried that and it went pretty well. Although I have to say, one of our mentors in Fort Collins told us 30 days will not be enough. And it wasn't. As soon as we started allowing guests, sorry, I have a tickle. We started seeing a lot of things kind of going south. So we had to visit with somebody particularly about that. And in that meeting with her, in which we were giving her a lease violation, because we've talked to her a few times about it, she explained to me that she thought that no overnight guests meant that the person had to basically leave before morning, that they weren't going, that they could come and visit at night, because that's actually when this person was mostly awake and mostly lived their life and was used to living their life was at nighttime. They were used to having a nighttime social life. And I don't know what all the other reasons were for why her visitors came and visited her at night. I mean, we don't delve into that, but it was very great and interesting aha moment when we were visiting with her, that she wasn't really thinking that she was deliberately going against a policy. She was getting those people out before morning. And so you can imagine, though, as a property manager, you have to take a breath in a moment like that. And you have to say, oh, I just don't believe that. Or you can say, wow, I never thought of it that way. I'm glad that you explained that to me. Let's see if we can get back on track now. And I have to admit, this person has been back on track. And I think they benefited from the conversation, and I know I benefited from the conversation. And remember, it's possible in moments like that for there to be more than one truth. People can have a truth that belongs to them, and you can have a truth that belongs to you. And it isn't necessarily something that you can subject to a fact check. But the point of is that the policy was understood differently by the tenant.
So we've got a few minutes left, and I thought it would be great if everybody could say, sort of in very brief phrases, a lesson you would want to pass on to someone, perhaps ourselves working on the Trinity project that's going to break ground soon, or somebody in another community in Montana that wanted to do this. I'll kick it off with, and so you guys got to keep track of your acronyms. So HGF and PBVs. Housing Trust Fund is a source of funding that is really a good source to use for this. And the state's been great about receiving projects. And you want to talk to your local housing authority about project basing Section 8, whether it's the state or a local authority. Those are going to be key components to make the thing happen in the first place. And then I guess the other thing is start those meetings, those weekly meetings, as early as you possibly can, and continue them. We continue them to this day, and I don't see it stopping during the whole time. But the sooner you start, the better. Lisa, since we didn't get you another shot, you want to?
I'll try. My brain is like, okay, what's the big lesson that I want to share? And it's coming up a little blank, not for lack of lessons. I think kind of back to that definitions thing. I know we're kind of a broken record here, but the reality is there's two prominent different frames of reference. And like, kind of like Ellie was saying, myself in a service provider role I'm first going to advocate for the folks I work with and try and push that barrier a little bit. But I also have to understand that a building needs to be run. There's rules for a reason. Everyone needs to be safe there. So it's a lot of just like being flexible, thinking through your frames of reference, trying to understand the other frame of reference, and moving forward from there as best as you can. So I'll pass it on to whomever wants to jump up next.
I would say, building on that, actually, Lisa, is having a good understanding of all of the programs that are in the building to begin with, because that plays a big role in how the housing authority has to operate a program, and how those will fit together with the social services, and things like screening applicants and what's going to stop someone from possibly getting into the building. We're trying to do low barrier housing, but HUD still has some rules that, can kind of put the brakes on that a little bit. So, Anna.
Yeah, I agree with what you've all shared. I think that, an understanding, for me, I've asked a lot of questions, and it's so that I really can understand everything and like try to see it from other people's perspective. And so I would encourage people to do that deep dive and like, what does HUD absolutely say no to? Where's the wiggle room? What does this funding really look like in the rentals? Like there's a minimum rent of $50, which we're all finding out is very hard, to expect people to cover if they aren't working or not capable. There's a lot of other details involved in that too, but and then a thing that I want to do is focus on like getting the tenants' voices into this matter so that we really can use their voice to inform Trinity more outside of our lessons that we've learned. Because as Ellie shared that great story of like how they view the rules or what their interpretation is. And I think that could help us all clear up a lot of things that maybe have caused tension for us. And then maybe just a little team building. Maybe that's the social worker in me, but it's two agencies coming together that aren't familiar with each other. Like we've worked with each other in some form or capacity, but at the end of the day, there's a lot for us to learn about one another. And then don't do this during a pandemic where you are doing everything over Zoom, because that is very hard to, Zoom and email, has their limitation in communication. So I think we've done a pretty good job, but I really like in-person things. So.
And Ellie, so looks like somebody in Butte wants to replicate this. What's your one takeaway for them planning it now?
Yeah, well, we had a grant, a big old planning grant that I don't know all about certainly, but I know that there were 3 phases. So we were implementing a second phase of this grant, and the third phase will be a program that has a navigation center, so 20, and a dedicated staff in the building. So it's hard to say, like what we plan to do and set out to do, we're doing. And we're doing the best that we can. And we've got almost 12 people housed that wouldn't be housed otherwise. And like I said, the majority of those folks are doing pretty darn well in that building. And I think we're all doing pretty darn well. But I will just end with the note that it is very hard to do any kind of supportive service housing without people on site, and without offices for those people and restrooms for those people. And we just have to remember too, that as we want those tenants to adjust to living indoors after living out of doors, there's gonna be this really high level of appreciation from those tenants that is unlike anything you've really ever experienced in any of your other buildings, or at least I have. And it just catches you, usually at the right moment when you feel like, I am never coming back to this building again. Somebody thanks you for the smallest thing that you've done that you would never have thought was, that big of a deal. But we really need to have our staff on site to be able to make this truly a supportive housing experience for folks, staff and tenants, really.
Right. No, I think, Ellie, I was going to echo that, is just that gratitude for all the providers. I mean, you guys have in Montana, jumped off that cliff together, holding hands and not knowing where the safety net's going to be to land on, and just that model of mutual support. And that's what's going through my mind from the foundation lens, is how can the foundation continue to support the planning and the development, but then how do we support the supportive housing providers as you go through some really challenging times and learning lessons and things like that, because that care for the carers is huge. And I'm actually right downtown Philadelphia right now. I came out here for my son's graduation, and my square walk here, probably I've seen 12, 14 different homeless individuals in a 4-block radius. And I think about Montana and Missoula and the work you're doing, just one by one, that you can solve homelessness. I know that's Missoula's goal, is that 10-year plan, and you've taken some big steps to really work with those ones that really need the most coordination and care. So
and thank you, Ted. And so those of you in those L named cities that he's mentioned earlier, if you're the Healthcare Foundation is doing phenomenal work in this area across the state, and Ted's really great to work with. The foundation is really great to work with, and very I'd say generous in the best senses of the word. When we we're opening a building, and we thought, well, it'd be nice to put some, in addition to furnishing some, stuff for basic things like dishes and so on and whatnot that people might not have and need. Ted was like, yeah, we could figure that out. And so really, thank you, Ted, and thank you to the foundation, because it's all your work has been really, really phenomenal base to start on. We are just about out of time. There's Bruce, I see it, so that must mean that we're getting pretty close. How are we doing? Are we done?
We're right on time. So
well, thank you, everyone. Thank my panelists, because I know it's very I know from my perspective, I've been nervous all day for this, so I'm sure it's a commitment of you guys to come forward and speak. This is not what you usually are asked to do. So thank you very much. And thanks to Lori and Ted. And thanks, Bruce. Always the great pilot.
yeah, thanks,
Jim.
Have a great rest of the conference.
Speakers, thank you. And thanks to the panelists. That was great. You guys really done some great work in Missoula, especially. Just amazing. So thank you for joining us for this session. Remember, you can always participate in community conversations through the WOVA app or to chat more. We will now be on a 1-hour lunch break and we'll be back at 1 o'clock. We look forward to having you back for the breakout sessions. I think we'll have an hour breakout session for this track and then some question and answers for about a half hour. So please come back at 1 o'clock. Thanks, guys.